The rusted Harley had been sitting in Mel's scrapyard for 15 years, a monument to the Hell Angels chapter that got wiped out in the Desert Wars of 2008. Chrome stripped, engine seized, tires rotted, it was nothing but metal bones baking under the Nevada sun. So when the old drifter shuffled up to it, mumbling words nobody understood while laying his weathered hands on the gas tank, the locals just shook their heads and laughed. "Crazy old fool thinks he's some kind of motorcycle whisperer," they snickered. But then something impossible happened. The dead engine coughed, once, twice, then erupted into a thunderous roar that shook dust from every building on Main Street. The drifter's eyes weren't laughing anymore. They burned with the cold fire of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. As the Harley's headlight blazed to life, casting shadows that looked like dancing demons, one terrifying question hung in the desert air. What happens when a dead man's bike chooses to ride again? The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats like strangled birds. Mel Rodriguez pushed through the circle of onlookers, his face pale beneath his weathered baseball cap. He'd owned this scrapyard since before the wars, had seen the Hell Angels roll through this forgotten stretch of Nevada highway in their glory days. He knew this particular bike's history better than anyone. "That's Johnny Reaper's ride," Mel whispered, loud enough for the others to hear. "Been dead longer than the man who rode it." The drifter's head turned slowly toward Mel, and for a moment, everyone caught a glimpse of his face beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Deep lines carved canyons around eyes that had seen too much. A scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, disappearing into a grey beard that hung to his chest. But it was those eyes that made Mel take a step back. They held the weight of ghosts and the promise of violence. "Johnny Reaper died in the desert," the drifter said, his voice like gravel scraping against concrete. "But bikes like this don't die. They just sleep until someone with the right touch comes along." Sarah Chen, the town's mechanic, and the only person under 50 who understood engines, pushed closer. She'd been working on cars and bikes since she was 12, had inherited her father's garage when cancer took him 3 years back. What she was seeing violated every law of mechanical physics she knew. "That engine was seized solid," she said, shaking her head. "I looked at it myself 2 years ago. Cylinders were rusted through, valves were frozen. There's no way it should be running." The drifter swung a leg over the bike, settling into the cracked leather seat like he belonged there. The Harley's engine settled into a deep rhythmic rumble that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Chrome that had been dull and pitted moments before now gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the tires that had been rotting rubber, donuts, were somehow whole again, their treads deep and black. "Sometimes what looks dead is just waiting for the right resurrection," the drifter said, revving the engine. The sound echoed off the surrounding mountains like thunder. "Sometimes a man has to die before he can really live." Old Pete Morrison, who ran the diner and had been serving coffee to bikers since the 60s, squinted through thick glasses. Something about the drifter's voice, the way he sat on that bike, triggered a memory that had been buried for 2 decades. "Jesus Christ," Pete breathed. "It can't be." The drifter's eyes met Pete's across the crowd. A ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Thought you might remember, old man. You made a hell of a cup of coffee back in the day." Pete's knees nearly buckled. "But you're dead. We all heard what happened in Barstow. The Razors said they buried you in the desert with the rest of your chapter. The Razors said a lot of things." The drifter's hands tightened on the handlebars. "Doesn't make them true." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the desert heat. The Razor Brotherhood was a name that still brought fear to anyone who remembered the gang wars. They'd swept through Nevada like a plague, destroying every rival chapter they encountered. The Hell Angels had been the last to stand against them, and when the smoke cleared, both organizations had vanished into legend. The drifter kicked the bike into gear, the transmission engaging with a solid chunk that sent vibrations through the ground. He looked out over the assembled crowd, his gaze lingering on each face as if memorizing them. "Name's Marcus Kane," he said finally. "Some of you might remember that name. Others will learn it soon enough." He paused, listening to something only he could hear. "The Razors think they won the war 20 years ago. Time to teach them the difference between winning and surviving." Without another word, he gunned the engine and roared out of the scrapyard, leaving behind nothing but exhaust fumes and the lingering smell of sulfur. The Harley's engine growled like a caged beast as Marcus wheeled it into the back bay of his garage, away from prying eyes. The machine shouldn't be running. Hell, it shouldn't even be in one piece. He'd seen enough wrecked bikes in his 30 years as a mechanic to know twisted metal when he saw it, and what that stranger had been working on was nothing more than scrap yesterday. Yet here it sat, chrome gleaming under the fluorescent lights, every component perfectly aligned as if it had rolled off the factory floor moments ago. The custom paintwork showed a skeletal rider wreathed in flames, the detail so intricate Marcus could swear he saw the bones shifting in his peripheral vision. "Impossible," he muttered, running weathered fingers along the fuel tank. The metal was warm to the touch, though the engine had been off for minutes. The bell above his front door chimed, and Deputy Sarah Chen stepped inside, her uniform crisp despite the desert heat. She'd been making more frequent stops lately, ever since the incident started. Livestock found dead with no explanation. Strange lights seen dancing across the highway at midnight, and now this. "Morning, Marcus. Heard you had some excitement yesterday." He emerged from the back bay, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. Just some drifter looking to fix his ride. Nothing worth reporting. Sarah's dark eyes studied his face with the intensity that made her a good cop. "Mrs. Henderson says she saw flames shooting 30 feet in the air, said it looked like the whole place was on fire. Mrs. Henderson needs new glasses. Was just welding work, bright torch. You know how these old folks exaggerate." But Sarah wasn't buying it. She moved past him toward the back bay, and Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Mind if I take a look around? Make sure everything's—" The rumble of approaching motorcycles cut her off. Not just one or two, but the deep, synchronized thunder of a full riding formation. They both moved to the front window and watched as a line of bikes crested the hill leading into town, their chrome catching the morning sun like signals of war. "Jesus," Sarah breathed. "Must be 20 of them." Marcus felt ice form in his gut as he recognized the colors, red and black leather cuts with a serpent devouring its own tail. The Ouroboros MC. He'd hoped never to see those patches again, had prayed the stories of their dissolution were true. The formation pulled into the diner parking lot across the street with military precision. Their leader dismounted first, a mountain of a man whose scarred face had haunted Marcus's nightmares for 2 decades. Victor the Viper Kozlov, president and executioner, the man who'd ordered the massacre that wiped the Hell's servants from existence. "You know these guys?" Sarah's hand had instinctively moved to her service weapon. Marcus shook his head, though his mouth had gone bone dry. "Never seen them before." But Victor was looking directly at the garage now, his pale eyes scanning the building like a predator selecting prey. He said something to his lieutenant, a wiry man with tear tattoos marking kills beneath his left eye. The lieutenant nodded and began posting riders at strategic points around the town's main intersection. "This doesn't feel like a social visit," Sarah murmured into her radio, calling for backup that Marcus knew wouldn't arrive in time to matter. The stranger from yesterday emerged from the motel across the street, moving with that same unhurried gait. He'd changed clothes but still wore the worn leather jacket, and Marcus noticed for the first time the faded patches on the sleeves, patches that had been carefully removed, leaving only ghost outlines of what they'd once displayed. Victor saw him too. The big man's hand dropped to the knife on his belt as recognition dawned across his features. Even at this distance, Marcus could see the shock, then the rage that followed. "Well, well," Victor's voice carried across the street. "Johnny fucking Reaper. Heard you died screaming in Tucson." The stranger, Johnny, stopped in the middle of the street, his hands loose at his sides. When he spoke, his voice held the rasp of a man who'd gargled smoke and flame. "Not dead, Victor. Just waiting. For what? For you to come back, and finish this." The tension stretched taut as piano wire. Marcus watched as both groups of bikers shifted position, hands moving to weapons, engines revving in anticipation. Sarah was speaking rapidly into her radio, requesting every available unit, calling in favors from neighboring counties. But Marcus knew it wouldn't matter. This wasn't about law and order. This was about blood debts and brotherhood bonds forged in chrome and vengeance. This was about ghosts rising from shallow graves to collect what was owed. Victor's laughter cracked like a whip across the morning air. "You always were too stupid to stay dead, Johnny. But don't worry, we'll fix that mistake real permanent this time." The first shot shattered the morning silence, and hell came to Perdition Flats on burning wheels. The Rusty Anchor's neon sign flickered against the growing dusk as Marcus Cross pushed through the heavy wooden doors. Conversations died like snuffed candles, and every head in the bar turned toward him. He expected this. Small towns had long memories and longer tongues. Word traveled fast when a stranger rolled into town on a bike that shouldn't exist. Sheriff Elena Vasquez sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a beer and watching him in the mirror behind the bottles. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. Her uniform was crisp despite the desert heat, and her hand rested casually near her service weapon. Marcus approached the bar, his boots echoing on the worn wooden floor. The bartender, a grizzled man with arms like tree trunks, eyed him warily. "Whiskey. Neat," Marcus said, settling onto a stool 2 seats away from the sheriff. The bartender poured without comment, sliding the glass across the scarred surface. Marcus lifted it, studying the amber liquid in the dim light. 20 years of running, and he'd ended up right back where it all began. "Hell of a bike you got there," Sheriff Vasquez said, not looking at him directly but watching his reflection. "Real vintage piece. She's been in the family a long time." "Funny thing about that bike." Vasquez turned on her stool to face him. "Old-timers around here swear they've seen it before." "Course. That's impossible, seeing as how the original burned up in a crash 20 years back." Marcus took a slow sip of whiskey, feeling it burn down his throat. "People see what they want to see. Maybe. Or maybe they see ghosts." Her voice carried an edge now. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Mr. Cross, Marcus Cross?" The name hung in the air between them like smoke. If she recognized it, she didn't show it, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Well, Mr. Cross, I hope you're not planning on staying long. Peaceful town like this doesn't need the kind of trouble that follows certain types." Before Marcus could respond, the bar's front door exploded inward. 3 men strode through, leather-clad and radiating menace. The leader wore the distinctive crimson and black colors of the blood serpents, the patch on his back depicting a coiled snake with fangs bared. Marcus recognized him immediately. Tommy Viper Castellanos, though age had thickened his face and grayed his beard. The bar's patrons scrambled for the exits like startled rabbits. Within seconds, only Marcus, the sheriff, the bartender, and the 3 bikers remained. Viper's gaze swept the room before settling on Marcus. A slow, predatory smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, well, if it isn't the ghost of Christmas past." Viper's voice was rough as sandpaper. "Heard you might be in town, Reaper, though I gotta say you're looking pretty solid for a dead man." Sheriff Vasquez's hand moved to her weapon. "That's enough. Whatever business you boys think you have, you can take it outside." Viper laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "This ain't your concern, Sheriff. This is old family business. Ain't that right, Reaper?" Marcus set down his whiskey glass with deliberate care. When he looked up, something had changed in his eyes, a cold fire that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. 20 years, Tommy. You've gotten soft. Boffed." Viper's smile faltered. "Brother, I've been running the Western Territories while you've been playing hide-and-seek. The blood serpents own everything from here to the coast now. We finished what we started that night. Did you?" Marcus stood slowly, his movements fluid and controlled. "Because it looks to me like you missed one." The two bikers flanking Viper reached for weapons, but Sheriff Vasquez was faster, her Glock appearing in her hands with practiced speed. "Nobody's drawing iron in my town," she said, her voice steady as granite. "I don't know what happened 20 years ago, and right now I don't care. But if anyone so much as twitches wrong, they'll be explaining themselves to a coroner." Viper held up his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes never left Marcus. "Easy, Sheriff. We're just having a reunion here. Old Brotherhood and all that." "The Brotherhood's dead," Marcus said quietly. "You made sure of that when you burned them alive in their clubhouse." The words hit Viper like a physical blow. His face darkened, and for a moment Marcus saw the killer he remembered from 2 decades past. They chose their side, just like you're choosing yours now. Viper backed toward the door, his men following. "This ain't over, Reaper. The serpents remember their enemies, and we always collect our debts." After they left, silence stretched like a taut wire. Sheriff Vasquez slowly holstered her weapon, her eyes fixed on Marcus with new understanding. 20 years ago," she said finally. "The Burning Angels massacre. You're him, aren't you? The one they never found." Marcus picked up his whiskey and drained it in one swallow. "That man died in the desert 20 years ago. Then, are you?" Marcus looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her blood run cold. "I'm what's left." The sun had barely crested the horizon when Maria Santos pulled into the parking lot of the Copper Kettle Diner, dust swirling behind her patrol cruiser. She'd been driving the desert roads since 4 a.m., unable to sleep after what she'd witnessed the night before. The rational part of her mind kept trying to explain away the impossible, trick mirrors, staged pyrotechnics, some elaborate hoax. But 20 years in law enforcement had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct screamed that something supernatural had rolled into perdition. Inside the diner, the morning crowd was unusually subdued. Conversations died as she entered, replaced by nervous glances and the clink of coffee cups against saucers. Maria slid into her usual booth and nodded to Dolores behind the counter. "Coffee's already brewing your way, hun," Dolores called out, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. "You hear about what happened out at the old garage?" Before Maria could respond, the diner's bell chimed, and Pete Kowalski shuffled in, his mechanic's coveralls stained with fresh grease despite the early hour. His hands trembled as he poured 3 sugars into his coffee. "Pete," Maria called softly, "you look like you've seen a ghost." The old mechanic's laugh came out as a bitter bark. "Maybe I have. Maybe we all have." He glanced around the diner, then leaned closer. "That stranger, the one who came into my shop yesterday, he knew things, Maria. Things about bikes I ain't worked on in decades. Things about people who've been dead for 20 years. Maria felt ice form in her stomach. "What kind of things?" He asked about Danny Reeves, specifically. Pete's voice dropped to a whisper. "Asked if I still had any of his bike parts in the back." Now how the hell would some random drifter know about Danny's Harley? That bike was destroyed in the accident, scattered across 50 yards of highway. The name hit Maria like a physical blow. Danny Reeves, the local kid who'd joined the Hell's Brotherhood motorcycle club and died in a fiery crash on Route 666 exactly 20 years ago. She'd been a rookie deputy then, fresh out of the academy, and Danny's death had been her first real case. The images were seared into her memory, twisted metal, flames that burned too hot and too bright, and a body so charred that identification had only been possible through dental records. "There's more," Pete continued, his voice barely audible. "After he left, I went to check the storage room. That box of Danny's parts, the one I kept meaning to throw away but never could. It was gone. Every last piece." Maria's radio crackled to life, cutting through the tension. "Unit 7, we've got a situation at the old Morrison property. Multiple reports of disturbances." The Morrison property, the abandoned ranch where the Hell's Brotherhood used to hold their meetings, where Danny Reeves had lived in a trailer behind the main house. Maria's blood turned to ice water. She was halfway to her cruiser when she spotted the motorcycle parked across the street. In daylight, it looked almost normal, a classic Harley-Davidson with custom flames painted along the tank. But something about it made her skin crawl. The chrome seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the black paint job was so deep it looked like staring into an abyss. The rider sat motionless, his face hidden behind a reflective visor. Even from across the street, Maria could feel his attention focused on her like a spotlight. When she took a step toward him, he slowly shook his head, a clear warning to stay back. A radio crackled again, more urgent this time. "Unit 7, please respond. We've got reports of fires that won't go out and sounds like thunder with no clouds in the sky." Maria looked back at the motorcycle, but the street was empty. No bike, no rider, just heat shimmer rising from the asphalt. She blinked hard, wondering if the stress was finally getting to her, but the scent of sulfur lingered in the air like evidence of something unnatural. The drive to the Morrison property took 15 minutes, but Maria could see the smoke long before she arrived. Black columns rose straight up in the windless morning, and even with her air conditioning running, the temperature inside her cruiser seemed to climb with every mile. When she crested the final hill, her breath caught in her throat. The old ranch house stood exactly as it had for 2 decades, abandoned and falling apart, but the yard was different. Burned into the packed earth was a perfect circle 50 feet across, the sand turned to black glass. At the center sat a makeshift altar constructed from motorcycle parts, handlebars, chrome exhaust pipes and engine blocks arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. And standing at the altar's edge, his back to the road, was the stranger. Even at this distance, Maria could see the flames dancing along his shoulders, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was no longer dealing with anything remotely human. The crimson serpents rolled into Dust Creek at sunset, their chrome catching the dying light like knives. 23 bikes strong, they moved in formation down Main Street, engines thundering off the storefronts in a deafening symphony of menace. At their head rode Viper Kellerman, his silver hair whipping beneath a skull-adorned bandana, the same man who'd put 3 bullets in Marcus Kane's chest 2 decades ago. Sarah pressed herself against the window of Murphy's garage, watching the procession with growing dread. The townspeople scattered like tumbleweeds, disappearing into shops and homes, leaving the street empty except for the advancing wall of leather and steel. She'd seen enough gang documentaries to recognize the predatory confidence in their movements. They weren't just passing through. "Where is he?" she whispered, scanning the shadows for any sign of the mysterious rider who'd brought such strange electricity to their quiet town. Viper raised his fist, and the entire convoy ground to a halt in front of the Red Dog Saloon. The sudden silence felt more ominous than their roar had been. He dismounted slowly, his weathered face split by a grin that held no warmth, only the anticipation of violence. His lieutenant, a mountain of a man called Hammer, flanked him as they approached the saloon's swinging doors. "Marcus Kane!" Viper's voice carried across the empty street like a gunshot. "I know you're here, you dead son of a bitch. Your little light show last night lit up police scanners 3 counties over." Inside the Red Dog, old Pete Martinez clutched his whiskey glass with shaking hands. The handful of other patrons had already fled through the back exit, but Pete was too stubborn or too drunk to move. He'd been tending bar here for 30 years, and he'd be damned if he'd be chased out by some leather-clad thugs. The doors burst open, and Viper strode in like he owned the place. His pale eyes swept the dim interior, cataloguing every shadow, every hiding spot. "Bartender, where's the man with the Hell Angels patch?" Pete's jaw tightened. "Don't know what you're talking about." Hammer's massive fist connected with the bar top, splintering the old wood. Bottles rattled and jumped. "Wrong answer, old man." "Easy, Hammer." Viper's voice was silk over razor wire. "The gentleman just needs some encouragement." He leaned across the damaged bar, close enough that Pete could smell the road dust and motor oil on his clothes. "See, Marcus Kane was supposed to die 20 years ago. My bullets, his blood, case closed. But last night someone fired up that cursed bike of his, and now the dead are walking again." Pete's eyes narrowed. "You're talking crazy." "Am I?" Viper straightened, pulling out a long-barreled revolver, the same gun he'd used to execute Cain's Brotherhood, one by one. Because I've seen what happens when the devil's own machinery starts breathing again. Towns burn, good men die, and legends crawl out of their graves looking for revenge. Outside, Sarah crept along the storefronts, trying to get closer to the saloon. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but something compelled her forward, maybe the same force that had drawn her to the garage last night. She could hear Viper's voice through the thin walls, cold and merciless. "The way I figure it," Viper continued, "Cain's got himself a new body somehow. Maybe he's possessing some poor fool. Maybe he's riding around in borrowed flesh. Don't matter to me. Dead once, dead again." The temperature in the saloon seemed to drop 10 degrees. The oil lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows that moved wrong, too fluid, too alive. Pete's breath began to mist, and Hammer took an involuntary step backward. What the hell? Hammer started. The lights went out. In the absolute darkness, the sound of a motorcycle engine rumbled to life somewhere impossibly close. Not outside in the street, but here, in the saloon itself, as if the devil's own ride was materializing from the shadows. Flames erupted from nowhere, blue-white fire that cast everything in stark, hellish relief. And there, straddling a bike that seemed to be forged from living shadow and burning chrome, sat the rider. His leather jacket bore the Hell Angels patch, pristine as the day it was earned. The skull beneath his black helmet was wreathed in supernatural fire. Viper stumbled backward, his gun forgotten in his trembling hand. "Impossible, I killed you. I watched you die." The rider's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the weight of 20 years of vengeance. "Death was just the beginning, Viper. You destroyed my brothers, scattered their ashes to the wind, but some debts follow you beyond the grave." The spectral motorcycle revved, its engine note a sound like screaming metal and tortured souls. Steam rose from the wooden floor where its tires touched, burning mystical symbols into the old planks. "Run," the Ghost Rider whispered, and somehow that quiet word was more terrifying than any shout. "Tell your crew that Marcus Cain has returned. Tell them hell is coming to collect what's owed." The Crimson Devils rolled into Copper Falls like a plague of locusts, their chrome gleaming malevolently under the desert sun. 23 bikes strong, their engines created a thunderous symphony that rattled windows and sent stray dogs scurrying for cover. At their head rode Marcus Skull Brennan, his weathered face bearing the same cruel sneer that had haunted Jake's nightmares for 2 decades. From behind the gas station's grimy window, Jake watched the procession with ice-cold fury coursing through his veins. The years had been kind to none of them, but cruelty had preserved Skull like vinegar preserves meat. The same dead eyes, the same predatory grin, the same complete absence of anything resembling human decency. "Jesus Christ," Tommy whispered beside him, his voice barely audible over the roar of engines. "There's so many of them." Jake's hand instinctively moved to the keys of the Night Rider, feeling their otherworldly warmth against his palm. The bike seemed to sense the approaching confrontation, its presence pressing against his consciousness, like a caged beast demanding release. The Devils came to a halt in the town square, their formation deliberate and intimidating. Skull dismounted slowly, his movements calculated for maximum psychological impact. He wore the same black leather vest, though now it was adorned with additional patches, each one a trophy, a conquered territory, a destroyed rival. Sheriff Morrison appeared from the courthouse, his hand resting on his service weapon, but his face betraying the hopelessness of their situation. Jake had seen that look before, in the eyes of lawmen who knew they were outgunned and outmanned. Morrison was a good cop, but he was just one man with a badge against a small army of killers. "Well, well," Skull's voice carried across the square as more townsfolk began to emerge from their hiding places. "Copper Falls. Looks like this shithole hasn't improved much since we last passed through. You boys need to move along," Morrison called out, his voice steady despite the odds. "This is a peaceful town." Skull's laugh was like broken glass scraping against concrete. "Peaceful? That's funny, Sheriff. See, we got word that this peaceful town has been harboring some interesting items. Vintage motorcycles, antiques that belong to us. Jake's jaw clenched. They'd come for the bikes, just as he'd expected. But more than that, they'd come because somehow word had reached them that the Hell Angels' legacy wasn't as dead as they'd believed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Morrison replied. "Course you don't." Skull gestured to two of his men, who immediately began moving toward the nearest buildings. "Boys, why don't you help the good sheriff remember? Sometimes a little property damage jogs the memory." The first devil kicked in the door of Martha's diner, the sound of splintering wood echoing across the square. Through the gas station window, Jake saw Martha herself cowering behind the counter, her face pale with terror. That was enough. Jake turned from the window, his decision crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. Tommy grabbed his arm, eyes wide with desperation. "Jake, don't. There's too many of them. We need to call for backup. Get the state police." "There isn't time." Jake gently removed Tommy's hand. "And you know as well as I do that backup wouldn't be enough. This is personal, Tommy. It always was." He walked toward the Knight Rider, each step bringing the bike's supernatural presence into sharper focus. The machine seemed to pulse with anticipation, its chrome gleaming with an inner light that had nothing to do with the fluorescent bulbs overhead. "Jake!" Sarah's voice stopped him cold. She stood in the doorway of the service bay, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Whatever you're thinking of doing." "I'm thinking of ending this," he said quietly, "the way I should have 20 years ago. By getting yourself killed? By leaving this town without its protector?" Her voice cracked. "By leaving me?" The last words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, the weight of what he was about to sacrifice threatened to break his resolve. A normal life, a chance at happiness, a future with the woman who'd somehow seen past the darkness in his soul to the man he might still become. Outside, the sound of breaking glass punctuated by cruel laughter announced that the devils had escalated their intimidation. A woman screamed, "Mrs. Chen from the flower shop." Jake realized with growing anger. "I'm already dead, Sarah," he said softly. "Have been for 20 years. This is just making it official." He swung his leg over the Knight Rider, and the transformation was instantaneous. Power flooded through him, dark and intoxicating, banishing the last vestiges of Jake Sullivan and awakening something far more dangerous. The bike's engine ignited without the key, its roar drowning out the devil's machines like thunder drowning out rainfall. Through the garage's open door, he could see Skull's head snap up, recognition and impossible fear dawning on the gang leader's scarred features. The Ghost Rider had returned. The Crimson Serpents arrived at dawn like a plague of locusts descending on wheat fields. Their motorcycles thundered through the desert silence, kicking up clouds of red dust that hung in the air like dried blood. 37 riders strong, they rolled into perdition with the confidence of conquerors returning to claim territory that had never truly been theirs. Marcus King Caldwell led the formation, his chrome-plated Harley gleaming despite the dust. 20 years had thickened his waist and grayed his beard, but his eyes still held the cold calculation that had made him the most feared gang leader in 3 states. The skull tattoo on his neck had faded, but the cruelty behind it had only intensified with age. They stopped at the town's single traffic light, a relic that blinked red in all directions more often than it worked properly. King raised his fist, and the rumbling chorus of engines fell silent. In that sudden quiet, perdition felt smaller, more vulnerable, like a mouse cowering in the shadow of a hawk. 20 years, King announced to his riders, his voice carrying across the empty main street. 20 years we've waited for this moment. Elena watched from behind the blinds of her diner, her coffee pot trembling in her hands. The morning rush, all 12 customers, had frozen mid-bite, their breakfast growing cold as they processed the reality of what they were seeing. Old Pete Murphy, a Vietnam vet who'd seen his share of bad situations, quietly reached for the shotgun he kept behind the register. "Nobody moves," Elena whispered. "Nobody does anything stupid." 3 blocks away in the sheriff's station, Deputy Sarah Chen was frantically trying to raise Sheriff Williams on the radio. He'd driven out to investigate reports of strange lights near the old Brotherhood compound and hadn't checked in since midnight. The static-filled silence on the other end of the transmission felt ominous. King's lieutenant, a scarred man called Tombstone, pulled alongside his leader. "Want me to send scouts to confirm he's here?" "No need," King replied, his gaze fixed on something down the street. "I can feel him, like an old wound that aches before a storm." The Serpents had come prepared for war. Gun cases were strapped to several bikes, and the bulges under their leather jackets suggested enough firepower to level half the town. This wasn't just about settling an old score. It was about sending a message that would echo through the underground for decades. At the far end of Main Street, a figure emerged from behind Manny's garage. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking the purposeful stride, the way the morning shadows seemed to bend around him like living things. Jake walked down the center of the road, his boots echoing off the storefronts with the steady rhythm of a funeral march. "Well, well," King muttered, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "The dead do rise." Jake stopped 50 yards away, close enough for conversation but far enough to avoid any sudden moves. The rising sun created a halo of light behind him, making it difficult to make out his features clearly. But his voice carried with perfect clarity when he spoke. "You're a long way from home, Marcus." "So are you, Ghost. So are you." King dismounted his bike with deliberate slowness. "Heard you'd learned some new tricks. Got yourself a reputation for being unkillable. Only one way to find out." The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Behind King, the Serpents began to spread out, forming a loose semicircle. They'd done this before, the slow, methodical positioning that preceded violence. Several hands drifted toward concealed weapons. Elena's customers began quietly slipping out the back door of the diner, but she remained at her post by the window. Something told her this confrontation would determine the fate of their town, and she felt compelled to witness it. "You cost me everything," King called out, his voice gaining volume and venom. "My territory, my reputation, my brother. Your brother cost himself his life the moment he started dealing to kids." Righteous words from a dead man. King's hand moved to the pistol holstered at his hip. "Should have stayed buried, Jake. Should have let sleeping dogs lie. Some dogs need to be put down permanently." The wind picked up, swirling dust devils between the two groups. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, an eerie sound that made several of the younger Serpents shift nervously in their saddles. Deputy Chen's radio finally crackled to life, but instead of Sheriff Williams' voice, she heard only static punctuated by what sounded disturbingly like screaming. Her blood ran cold as she realized the Serpents might not be the only threat Perdition faced this morning. In the growing heat of the desert morning, 38 armed men faced off in a confrontation that would either end quickly in a burst of gunfire or escalate into something far more supernatural and terrifying than any of them could imagine. The Ghost Rider had returned, and hell was coming with him. The garage fell silent, except for the steady drip of motor oil hitting concrete. Jake stood frozen, his wrench suspended mid-air, watching the stranger who introduced himself as Marcus Kane work beneath the hood of the Harley. The bike that had sat dead for 2 decades now hummed with an otherworldly energy that made the hair on Jake's arms stand on end. "You're him," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine's supernatural purr. "You're the Ghost Rider." Marcus didn't look up from his work, but his hands stilled on the chrome manifold. "That name died with my brothers 20 years ago." "The hell it did." Jake set down his tools, moving closer despite every instinct screaming at him to run. "I was just a kid, but I remember the stories. How you took on the entire Crimson Serpents crew single-handed, how they found their bikes melted into slag the next morning, but never found you." A bitter laugh escaped Marcus's lips as he straightened, wiping grease from his hands with methodical precision. The scars across his knuckles seemed to writhe in the fluorescent light. "They found me. or what was left of me. 3 bullets to the chest, dumped in a ravine outside Barstow. Should have been the end of it. Jake's mouth went dry. Should have been? Marcus finally met his gaze, and Jake saw something inhuman flickering behind those dark eyes. Flames that burned without heat, rage that transcended the grave. Death has a funny way of not taking when there's unfinished business, when innocent blood cries out for justice. The Harley's engine revved without anyone touching the throttle, as if responding to Marcus's words. Blue-white flames licked along the exhaust pipes, leaving no scorch marks on the metal. Jesus Christ, Jake breathed, stumbling backward. He's got nothing to do with this, Marcus said, swinging a leg over the bike. The moment he settled into the saddle, the machine transformed. Black leather and chrome became something forged in the depths of hell itself. The headlight blazed like a fallen star, and the wheels left smoldering tracks on the concrete floor. Outside, the sound of approaching motorcycles cut through the desert night. Dozens of them, their engines roaring in perfect synchronization, a predator's call that every biker knew meant trouble was coming fast. "The serpents found you," Jake said, his face pale as he peered through the garage's grimy window. Red and gold colors gleamed under the streetlights as the rival gang formed a semicircle around the building. "No," Marcus corrected, his voice carrying a hollow echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I found them." The garage door burst open without warning. 3 Serpents members stormed in, their leather cuts adorned with patches that told stories of violence and territory wars. The leader, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a beard stained with motor oil, stopped short when he saw Marcus on the Harley. "Well, I'll be damned," the Serpent growled, recognition dawning in his small, cruel eyes. "Tommy, the wrench Morrison said he put you in the ground permanent-like." "Tommy was always too eager with his work," Marcus replied, revving the engine. The sound reverberated through the garage like thunder in a canyon, sloppy, like the way you serpents handled my brothers at Devil's Crossing. The mention of that night 20 years ago sent a visible chill through the 3 intruders. Devil's Crossing, where the Iron Hounds had made their last stand, where good men had died protecting a small town from the Serpent's drug operation. "Ancient history," the leader snarled, but his hand moved instinctively toward the pistol tucked in his waistband. "Tommy's the national president now. Got 3 chapters under his command. You're outnumbered 50-1. Marcus smiled, and Jake caught a glimpse of something that made his blood freeze. For just an instant, Marcus's face wasn't entirely human, skull showed through translucent flesh, and those eyes burned with hellfire. "I like those odds," Marcus said. The Harley shot forward like a bullet from a gun. The lead Serpent barely had time to draw his weapon before 300 pounds of supernatural motorcycle slammed into his chest, launching him through the garage's back wall in an explosion of splintered wood and twisted metal. The other 2 Serpents opened fire, their bullets sparking harmlessly off the bike's transformed frame. Marcus spun the Harley in a tight circle, the rear wheel catching one man across the jaw with a sickening crack. The third tried to run, but chains of hellfire erupted from the bike's exhaust, wrapping around his ankles and dragging him back. When the smoke cleared, Jake found himself alone in the garage. Through the gaping hole where his back wall used to be, he could see Marcus riding out into the desert night to face the rest of the Serpents. The Ghost Rider had returned, and 20 years of buried sins were about to come due. In the distance, screaming began. The desert wind carried the scent of burning rubber and something else, something that made Deputy Martinez cross herself as she watched the lone figure astride the legendary motorcycle disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. Behind her, the town of Perdition's Crossing lay shrouded in an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant rumble of approaching thunder that had nothing to do with the cloudless sky overhead. Jake Raven had been riding for 3 hours when he felt them, the familiar presence of his fallen brothers pressing at the edges of his consciousness. Their whispers grew stronger as he guided the Hell Angel's bike deeper into the wasteland, toward the place where it all began. The machine beneath him pulsed with otherworldly energy, its chrome gleaming despite the lack of moonlight, exhaust flames licking the air like serpents' tongues. The iron serpents would expect him to run, to disappear back into whatever hellish realm had hidden him for 2 decades. They'd counted on fear to keep the dead buried, but Marcus Stone had made a fatal miscalculation. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and death was no escape from justice. Miles behind him, Stone stood in the ruins of what had once been Mickey's garage, surveying the carnage with cold satisfaction. Bodies of his advance scouts lay twisted among the wreckage, their weapons useless against an enemy that shouldn't exist. He kicked at a charred helmet, watching it roll into the shadows. 20 years I've been waiting for this ghost story to end, he growled to his lieutenant, a scarred man called Viper, who'd been there the night they'd burned out the Hell Angels. Time to put the dead back in the ground where they belong. Viper shifted uncomfortably, remembering the sight of Jake Raven materializing from flame and shadow. Boss, maybe we should... Should what? Stone's voice carried the edge of barely controlled rage. Run from a dead man. The iron serpents don't run from anything, especially not from some desert rat playing dress-up with a stolen bike. But even as he spoke the words, Stone felt the first tendrils of doubt creeping into his certainty. The men he'd sent ahead were experienced killers, not easily spooked rookies. Whatever had torn through them possessed power beyond anything in his considerable experience with violence. Jake brought the bike to a stop atop a ridge overlooking Devil's Canyon, the site of the Hell Angels' last stand. 20 years ago, this place had been a roaring inferno, filled with the screams of dying men and the thunder of gunfire. Now it lay silent as a tomb, bleached bones of motorcycles scattered like broken promises among the rocks. He dismounted and walked to the edge, feeling the weight of memory pressing down like a physical force. Below, he could see the exact spot where Tommy Rodriguez had made his final charge, riding straight into an iron serpent ambush to buy time for the others to escape, where Big Mike Harrison had stood his ground with a shotgun against impossible odds, where Danny Prophet Williams had called out a warning before Stone's sniper bullet found its mark. I know you're watching, Jake spoke to the empty air, his voice carrying impossible distances on the desert wind. 20 years you've waited. 20 years you've wondered if any of us survived what you did here. The Hell Angel's bike behind him flared to life without any touch from its rider, flames wreathing the engine like a funeral pyre. In their dancing light, shapes began to move, translucent figures stepping from behind rocks and ruined metal, the ghosts of his brotherhood emerging from the shadows where they'd waited so long for justice. Tommy Rodriguez appeared first, his leather jacket still bearing the scorched holes from the bullets that had killed him. Big Mike materialized near the canyon wall, spectral shotgun cradled in his massive arms. One by one they came, 16 dead Hell Angels, their eyes burning with the same otherworldly fire that powered Jake's resurrection. The iron serpents are coming, Jake told them, though he knew they already understood. Stone thinks he can finish what he started, thinks death makes us weak. Prophet's ghost stepped forward, his voice echoing from beyond the grave. We've been waiting, Reaper, waiting for someone to settle the accounts. Jake nodded, feeling the familiar weight of his old road name settling around him like armor. Jake Raven had died in that canyon 20 years ago. What stood here now was something else entirely. The Reaper, Hell's own debt collector backed by the vengeful spirits of murdered brothers. In the distance, the rumble of approaching motorcycles began to vibrate through the desert floor. The iron serpents were coming in force, expecting to corner and kill one man. Instead, they would face 17 Hell Angels who had nothing left to lose and eternity to make their enemies pay. The Reaper mounted his burning bike as his ghostly brotherhood faded back into the shadows to await their moment. The final confrontation was about to begin, and this time the dead would not be denied their justice. The rumbles started before dawn, a distant thunder that rolled across the desert like a coming storm. Jake stood on the motel balcony, his enhanced hearing picking up the distinctive growl of Harley engines still miles out. Behind him, Sarah stirred in the bed, then sat up sharply as the sound reached her normal human ears. "How many?" she asked, already reaching for her clothes. Jake's eyes flickered with that otherworldly fire. 20, maybe 25. He turned from the window, his face grim. They're not hiding anymore. The Scorpions were making their final approach, and Jake knew Marcus Vance wouldn't repeat the mistake of underestimating him. This time, they'd come prepared for war. Downtown, Sheriff Williams was already coordinating the evacuation. The few remaining businesses shuttered their windows while families loaded into cars and headed for the highway, but not everyone was running. A handful of locals, mechanics from the garage, a few ranch hands, even old Pete from the diner, had taken Jake's offer to help defend the town. "You sure about this?" Williams asked Jake as they met in the street. "These aren't your people. You don't owe them anything." Jake checked the modified shotgun one of the mechanics had rigged for him, shells loaded with consecrated salt and iron filings. Maybe not, but this is where it ends. The first bikes appeared on the horizon just as the sun crested the mountains, their chrome gleaming like weapons in the early light. They rode in formation, no longer the loose pack of outlaws Jake remembered. These were soldiers now, disciplined and deadly. At their head, Marcus Vance sat astride a machine that seemed to drink in the desert light, its black paint job adorned with actual human skulls. They stopped at the town limits, engines idling in perfect synchronization. The sound was hypnotic, menacing, a mechanical heartbeat promising violence. Marcus removed his helmet and surveyed the nearly empty streets. When he spoke, his voice carried impossibly far, touched by the same dark power that had sustained him for 2 decades. "Jacob Henley," he called, "you've led us quite a chase, but it's time to pay for what you did to my brother." Jake stepped into the middle of Main Street, alone. The morning wind caught his leather jacket, and for a moment he looked exactly like the Ghost Rider from the legends, a spectre of vengeance born from chrome and gasoline. "Your brother chose his path, Marcus, same as you." "Tommy was 19, Marcus snarled. "Just a kid looking for acceptance. You murdered him. I stopped him from murdering innocent people." Jake's eyes began to glow. "Same thing I'm about to do to you." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Then Marcus smiled, revealing teeth that had been replaced with polished steel. "You think your little light show scares me?" He gestured, and his riders began to spread out, surrounding the town center. "I've had 20 years to prepare for this moment, 20 years to gather power you can't imagine." That's when Jake saw them, the marks carved into the fuel tanks of every Scorpion bike, symbols that hurt to look at directly, sigils that seemed to writhe and shift when observed. Marcus had made a deal with something far worse than any earthly gang. "Sheriff," Jake called without turning around, "get your people back. This isn't going to be the kind of fight you can help with." Williams hesitated, then began waving the volunteers toward cover. Whatever was about to happen, it had moved beyond the realm of bullets and badge. Marcus kicked his bike into gear, and the skull ornaments on his handlebars began to glow with sickly green fire. "You always were too noble for your own good, Jake. Let me show you what real power looks like." The Scorpions attacked as one, their bikes leaving trails of supernatural flame as they roared toward the center of town. But Jake was already moving, his own machine materializing beneath him in a burst of white-hot energy. The legendary Hell Angels bike responded to his will like an extension of his soul, its engine screaming a battle cry that shattered windows 3 blocks away. The first collision came at the intersection of Main and Desert Avenue. Jake's bike met 3 Scorpions head-on, supernatural forces clashing in an explosion of light and shadow. One rider went down immediately, his machine collapsing into rusted metal as Jake's purifying fire burned away the dark enchantments. But there were too many, and they kept coming. Marcus had turned his entire gang into vessels for malevolent spirits, sacrificing their humanity for power. They fought without fear, without mercy, their bikes rebuilding themselves even as Jake destroyed them. The battle raged through the streets of the small town, leaving trails of fire and twisted metal. Buildings caught flame from the supernatural energies, and the very air seemed to crackle with opposing forces. Jake found himself driven back toward the old garage where this had all began, Marcus and his remaining riders closing in like wolves surrounding wounded prey. The rumble of 37 motorcycles echoed through Devil's Canyon like thunder rolling across the desert floor. Marcus Razor Hendricks led the Iron Serpents in a tight formation, their black leather cuts gleaming in the afternoon sun. Behind him rode the survivors of the old war, men who remembered the taste of blood and the satisfaction of watching the Hell's Brotherhood burn. 20 years had done nothing to soften Razor's hunger for violence. If anything, the decades had sharpened it into something more precise, more calculated. His scarred face bore the marks of countless fights, and his eyes held the cold gleam of a predator who had never learned to feel remorse. "Boss!" shouted Tommy Snake Eyes Morrison over the engine noise, pulling his bike alongside Razor's custom Harley. "You sure it's really him? Ghost Rider's been dead for 2 decades. Razor's laugh was bitter as desert wind. "Dead men don't fix motorcycles, Tommy, and they sure as hell don't light up legendary bikes with their bare hands." He throttled harder, the speedometer climbing. "But if Jackson Cole wants to play ghost, I'll send him back to whatever hole he crawled out of. Permanently this time." The Iron Serpents had built their empire on the ashes of the Hell's Brotherhood. Drug routes, protection rackets, arms dealing, everything that had once belonged to Cole's crew now fed Razor's machine. He'd spent 20 years convincing himself that the Brotherhood's destruction had been about territory, about power, about the natural order of things. But in the dark hours before dawn, when whiskey couldn't silence the voices in his head, Razor knew the truth. It had been about fear. Fear of Jackson Cole's reputation, his loyalty, his ability to inspire men to die for an ideal. The Ghost Rider hadn't just been a skilled fighter, he'd been a symbol, and symbols were dangerous things in the wrong hands. The convoy crested a rise, and there it was, salvation. Arizona looking like a handful of dice thrown across the desert. Smoke still rose from what remained of the Iron Serpent's clubhouse, a black smudge against the blue sky that made Razor's jaw clench with rage. "Cocky bastard," he muttered. Cole had sent a message, all right, but messages work both ways. As they descended toward the town, Razor could see the residents scrambling for cover, windows slammed shut, doors locked, children yanked from sidewalks. Good. Fear was a useful tool, and this operation would require precision. No witnesses, no complications, no mercy. The formation thundered down Main Street like an invasion force, engines drowning out everything else. Razor raised his fist, and the convoy slowed, then stopped in a cloud of dust and exhaust in front of Maggie's diner. The sudden silence felt ominous, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant howl of desert wind. "Fan out," Razor commanded, swinging his leg over his bike. "Check every building, every alley, every rat hole. Cole's here somewhere, and so is that damn bike." He pulled a sawed-off shotgun from his bike's holster, checking the chambers. "Remember, I want Cole alive. That son of a bitch owes me 20 years of nightmares, and I'm collecting with interest." The Iron Serpents dispersed like spilled oil, black leather and chrome spreading across Salvation's dusty streets. Some kicked down doors, others peered into windows, all of them hungry for violence. This was what they lived for. The hunt, the fear in their prey's eyes, the moment when power revealed its true face. Razor himself headed for the garage, where his informant claimed Cole had been working. Each step felt like walking backward through time, toward a confrontation he'd been dreaming of for 2 decades. The Ghost Rider had haunted his sleep, appeared in reflections when he least expected it, whispered accusations in the wind. But ghosts weren't bulletproof, and revenge was a dish best served with overwhelming firepower. The garage stood empty, tools scattered across workbenches, the smell of motor oil and something else, something that made Razor's skin crawl. Sulfur, smoke, the metallic taste of fear. "Boss!" Tommy's voice cracked across the radio. "You need to see this!" Razor found his lieutenant standing in the middle of the town square, staring at the ground. Burned into the asphalt was a perfect circle, maybe 15 feet across, with strange symbols around the edges. The pavement was still warm to the touch, and the air shimmered with heat waves despite the cooling afternoon. "What the hell is this?" Razor demanded. Tommy's face had gone pale beneath his tattoos. "Some of the boys are saying it's devil magic. That Cole really did come back from the dead." Razor backhanded him hard enough to split his lip. "Cole's flesh and blood, just like you and me, and flesh bleeds." He studied the burned circle, his tactical mind working. "This is psychological warfare. He's trying to spook us." But even as he said it, Razor felt something cold crawling up his spine. Because in the center of that impossible circle, clear as a signature, was the outline of a motorcycle tire. And it was still smoking. The desert wind carried the scent of gasoline and death as Marcus stood beside his resurrected Harley, watching the horizon shimmer with heat waves and something far more dangerous. The Crimson Serpents would arrive before sunset. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he'd felt their betrayal 20 years ago when they'd left him burning in that canyon. Sheriff Rodriguez emerged from the diner, her face grim as she approached. Behind her, the town's main street buzzed with frantic activity. Business owners boarded windows, while families loaded cars with whatever belongings they could carry. The smart ones were leaving. The loyal ones were staying to fight. "Tommy's rallied 12 of the old crew," she said, checking her service weapon. "They're not the young riders they used to be, but they remember how to handle trouble." Marcus nodded, his scarred hands tracing the familiar curves of his bike's fuel tank. The motorcycle hummed with supernatural energy, its chrome gleaming despite decades in the desert. When he'd performed the ritual 3 days ago, he'd awakened more than just an old machine. He'd awakened the ghost that lived inside his own chest. "Serpents roll heavy," he said, his voice carrying the rasp of a man who'd breathed hellfire. "Vince won't come with just his core riders. He'll bring prospects, hangers-on, anyone desperate enough to follow him into a blood feud." A dust cloud appeared on the eastern road, growing larger by the minute. Not the serpents, too small, too early. A pickup truck materialized from the haze, engines straining as it raced toward town. Marcus recognized the driver before the vehicle stopped, Eddie Ramirez, one of Tommy's scouts. Eddie tumbled out, sweat-soaked and breathless. "They're coming!" 30 miles out, maybe 40 bikes strong, Vince's riding point with that custom chopper of his, the one with the snake wrapped around the frame. The memory hit Marcus like a physical blow. That chopper had been built with money stolen from the Hell Angels Club Fund, crafted by a master mechanic who disappeared after asking too many questions about payment. Vince had always taken what wasn't his. "How long?" Sheriff Rodriguez asked. 20 minutes, maybe less. They're riding hard." Marcus swung his leg over the Harley's seat, feeling the machine respond to his touch like a living thing. The engine's idle deepened, flames licking briefly from the exhaust pipes. Around town, the remaining Hell Angels emerged from the shadows where they'd been waiting. Grey-haired men who'd traded leather for denim, beer guts for wisdom, but their eyes still burned with the same defiance that had made them legends. Tommy pulled alongside on his restored Sportster, his grey beard braided with leather cord. "Just like Barstow, brother. Except this time, we're the ones choosing the ground." The plan was simple because it had to be. The Crimson Serpents would expect to find a broken-down desert town and a handful of aging bikers. Instead, they'd ride into a carefully orchestrated trap. Sheriff Rodriguez would seal the northern exit with her patrol units. The Hell Angels would control the southern road. And Marcus would meet Vince head-on in the middle of Main Street, just like the old days demanded. A child's cry echoed from somewhere behind the boarded windows, quickly silenced by a parent's hushing voice. These people had taken him in without question, had fed him and given him shelter when he was nothing but a scarred drifter with impossible stories. Now their sanctuary was about to become a battlefield because of him. The rumble reached them first, a low, menacing growl that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Then came the visible dust cloud, a brown wall advancing across the desert like an approaching storm. The Crimson Serpents rode in tight formation, their red and black colors snapping in the wind, chrome glinting like weapons in the afternoon sun. Marcus watched Vince's custom chopper lead the charge, and 20 years of rage crystallized into something cold and sharp in his chest. The man who'd ordered his execution, who'd burned down everything the Hell Angels had built, was finally within reach. "Remember," Tommy said, revving his engine, "we're not trying to kill them all, just making sure they can't hurt anyone else." But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. The Ghost Rider was awakening, and with it came memories of hellfire and justice served with iron and chrome. His Harley's engine note changed, becoming something that belonged more in nightmares than on earthly roads. The Serpents crested the last hill before town, their formation spreading wide as they prepared for whatever resistance awaited them. Vince raised his hand, signaling his riders to slow as they approached the main street. Marcus twisted his throttle, and the legendary Hell Angel's bike roared to life with supernatural fury. It was time to finish what had been started 2 decades ago in blood and betrayal. The Ghost Rider was coming home. The roar of engines split the desert air like thunder rolling across the valley. Sarah pressed her face against the diner window, counting the headlights streaming down the highway toward town. 20, maybe 30 bikes, their chrome gleaming under the afternoon sun like the teeth of some massive predator. "They're early," Jake muttered from behind the counter, his knuckles white as he gripped a coffee pot. "Weren't supposed to be here until nightfall." Marcus appeared in the doorway, his leather vest torn and bloodied from his ride back to town. The younger Angels had scattered to defensive positions throughout the settlement, but everyone knew they were outnumbered 3-1. The Reapers had called in every chapter from California to Texas. "Where's Johnny?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the approaching thunder. Marcus shook his head. "Haven't seen him since dawn." He took the panhead up into the hills. His eyes were haunted. "Maybe he ain't coming back. Maybe he knows this is a fight we can't win." Sarah remembered the look in Johnny's eyes when he'd spoken of his fallen brothers, the way his hands had trembled when he'd touched their photos. Whatever Johnny Blaze had become in his years of exile, whatever supernatural force now coursed through his veins, he wouldn't abandon another family to the Reaper's brutality. The lead bikes crested the hill overlooking the town, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. Victor Kozlov rode at the front, his massive frame dwarfing his custom chopper. Even at this distance, she could see the skull tattoos covering his arms, the same markings that had been carved into the bodies found in the desert 20 years ago. The Reapers descended into town like a plague of locusts, their engines creating a deafening symphony of destruction. They spread out through the streets with military precision, blocking every exit route. Some dismounted and kicked indoors, dragging terrified residents into the street. Others revved their engines in tight circles, tearing up the asphalt and filling the air with acrid smoke. Victor pulled up directly in front of the diner, his bike's engine ticking as it cooled. When he removed his helmet, Sarah saw a face that belonged in nightmares, scarred flesh stretched tight over prominent bones, eyes like chips of black ice. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from some long-ago battle. 20 years, Victor called out, his accent thick as motor oil. 20 years I wait for Ghost Rider to show his face again. Where is Johnny Blaze? Where is dead man who thinks he can hide from Victor Kozlov? Marcus stepped onto the diner's porch, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt. He ain't here, you Russian bastard. Just us. Victor laughed, a sound like grinding gears. Then maybe I start with you. Maybe I carve you up like I carved up your brothers back in 04. Remember Tommy Martinez? How he screamed when I took his eyes? The rage that flashed across Marcus's face was murderous. But before he could draw his weapon, the sound of a single motorcycle echoed from the hills above town. Every head turned toward the source, a steady, rhythmic rumble that seemed to make the very ground vibrate. Johnny Blaze appeared at the top of the main road, but something had changed. The panhead beneath him seemed alive now, its chrome parts gleaming with an inner fire. Smoke didn't just rise from its exhaust, it wreathed around Johnny like a living thing, and his eyes burned with the same orange flame that had consumed his brother's killer in the desert. He descended toward the town square slowly, deliberately, like death itself taking a leisurely ride. The Reaper's engines faltered and died one by one as he passed, as if his very presence was draining the life from their machines. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and frost began forming on the windows of nearby buildings, despite the desert heat. Victor's confident sneer wavered as Johnny pulled to a stop 50 feet away. When the Ghost Rider spoke, his voice carried the weight of 2 decades worth of vengeance. "You wanted me, Victor. Here I am." The Russian's hand moved to the sawed-off shotgun strapped to his bike, but Johnny raised his own hand in a gesture of patience. "Not yet. First, you're going to hear their names. Every brother you murdered, every innocent life you destroyed. Tommy Martinez, Billy Sanderson, Carlos Vega." As Johnny recited the names, the temperature continued to drop. Ice crystals formed in the air, and several Reapers began backing away from their leader. The smart ones, Sarah realized, the ones who could sense that whatever was about to happen would be beyond anything they'd signed up for. Victor finally found his voice. "You think you scare me, dead man? I killed you once already." Johnny's burning gaze never wavered. "That was your first mistake. Your second was coming back to finish what you thought you'd started." He gripped the panhead's handlebars, and the bike's engine roared to life with supernatural fury. "Now let me show you what 20 years of waiting for justice looks like." The motorcycle's engine roared like a caged demon as Jake throttled through the desert night, his spectral flames casting dancing shadows across the rocky terrain. Behind him, the lights of perdition grew smaller, but ahead lay something far more dangerous than the town he'd left behind. The Crimson Serpents had chosen their ground well, an abandoned mining complex where the Brotherhood had once made their last stand 20 years ago. Sarah's police cruiser struggled to keep pace, her radio crackling with updates from the state troopers racing to intercept the Serpents' convoy. But Jake knew they'd arrived too late. Marcus Vega had planned this reunion with the precision of a military operation, drawing Jake away from any potential backup to the place where everything had begun and ended. The mining complex emerged from the darkness like a graveyard of rusted metal and concrete bones. Skeletal remains of processing equipment reached toward the star-filled sky, while broken conveyor belts snaked between collapsed buildings. Jake could see the orange glow of campfires scattered throughout the ruins and the silhouettes of motorcycles arranged in defensive positions. As he approached the main gate, hanging crooked on its hinges, memories flooded back with painful clarity. Here, Tommy had fallen with a bullet through his chest. There, beneath that collapsed crane, Wild Bill had made his final charge against overwhelming odds. The ghosts of his brothers seemed to whisper from every shadow, their voices carried on the desert wind. Jake cut his engine 50 yards from the complex, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of mechanical thunder. The spectral flames around his skull flickered but didn't die. They never truly died anymore. He dismounted and began walking toward the camp, his boots crunching on gravel that had been stained with blood 2 decades ago. "Well, well," Marcus Vega's voice echoed from somewhere among the ruins. "The dead man walks." The Serpent's leader emerged from behind an overturned mining cart, flanked by a dozen of his most hardened killers. He looked older now, his face mapped with scars and his once black hair streaked with silver, but his eyes held the same cold malice that had haunted Jake's nightmares. "You should have stayed dead, Dalton," Marcus continued, pulling a chrome-plated .45 from his jacket. 20 years of looking over my shoulder, wondering when you'd crawl out of whatever hell you'd been hiding in." Jake's laugh was like grinding metal. "Hell's exactly where I've been, Marcus. And I brought some friends back with me." The flames around his head intensified, casting everything in hellish relief. "Tell me, do you still dream about them, my brothers you gunned down like dogs?" "Your brothers were small-time dealers who thought they owned this desert," Marcus spat. "We showed them different, just like we're about to show you." The Serpents spread out in a semicircle, their weapons glinting in the firelight. Jake counted 13 men, all armed, all eager for blood. In the old days, those odds would have meant certain death, but the old days were buried in this very ground. "You want to know the funny thing about being dead?" Jake said, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "Death has a way of clarifying things, Like how revenge isn't about evening scores, it's about justice. He raised his hand, and spectral fire began to dance between his fingers. And justice has been a long time coming. The first serpent who opened fire discovered that bullets passed harmlessly through Jake's ghostly form. The second learned that hellfire burns far hotter than any earthly flame when Jake's touch turned his weapon to molten slag. Panic rippled through their ranks as they realized they weren't fighting a man, they were fighting something far worse. Marcus emptied his clip into Jake's chest, watching the bullets pass through without effect. "What the hell are you?" "I'm the ghost you created," Jake replied, advancing steadily. With each step, the temperature around them seemed to drop, while the flames surrounding him grew brighter. "I'm every mile my brothers never got to ride, every sunrise they never got to see, every laugh they never got to share." Behind Marcus, his men were breaking ranks, their courage evaporating like morning mist. Some tried to reach their bikes, others simply ran into the darkness. But Jake wasn't interested in them, not yet. His burning gaze remained fixed on the man who had orchestrated the massacre. 20 years I've been waiting for this moment," Jake continued, his form beginning to shift and ripple like heat waves rising from sun-baked asphalt. 20 years of walking between worlds, gathering power, learning what it means to be the bridge between justice and vengeance. Marcus backed against a concrete wall, his face pale with terror. "You can't kill me, I'm already—" "Already what?" Jake's voice had become a chorus now, as if multiple spirits spoke through him. "Already dead inside? Already damned? Marcus, my old friend, that's exactly what makes this so perfect." The flames reached out like grasping fingers, and Marcus Vega's screams echoed across the desert, finally joining the chorus of voices that had been calling for justice for 20 long years. The serpents rolled into town like a plague of locusts, their engines screaming across the desert floor as dawn painted the sky blood red. Marcus watched from the water tower as the convoy stretched across the horizon, at least 40 bikes, maybe more. Chrome glinted like fangs in the early light. Below him, the townspeople had transformed overnight into something he'd never seen before. Mrs. Henderson clutched a hunting rifle that looked older than she was, while her husband checked the barricades they'd thrown up across Main Street. Deputy Collins moved between the defensive positions, his usual nervous energy replaced by grim determination. Even Father Miguel had traded his collar for a shotgun, though he still wore his cross. 20 years, Marcus muttered to himself, feeling the familiar burn in his chest where flesh met otherworldly flame. They sure know how to hold a grudge. The Hell Angels' bikes were arranged in a defensive line behind the town's makeshift barriers. Tommy worked frantically on the last few machines, his mechanical gifts pushing them beyond normal limits. Sarah coordinated the riders, her voice cutting through the morning air with military precision. But Marcus could see the truth in their faces. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The serpents stopped just outside rifle range, their formation spreading wide across the desert like a striking snake. At their head, Vincent Core sat astride a machine that seemed to devour light itself. The bike's frame was black as midnight, adorned with serpent imagery that writhed and shifted in ways that hurt to look at directly. Behind him, Marcus recognized faces from the old days, men who'd once called him brother before greed and power corrupted their souls. Core's voice carried across the distance, amplified by some unnatural resonance. 20 years, Ghost Rider. 20 years I've been building my empire while you played dead in whatever hole you crawled into. Did you really think you could hide behind these sheep forever? Marcus felt the fire stirring in his bones, responding to the challenge. But he forced it down, not yet ready to reveal his hand. The element of surprise was all they had. "I know you're out there, Marcus," Core continued, his laughter like breaking glass. "I can smell the sulfur on the wind. Come out and face me, or watch these good people burn for your cowardice." Down below, Sarah raised a megaphone. "This is private property. You're trespassing on federal land. Turn around and leave, or—" Her words were cut short as one of the serpents fired into the air, the gunshot echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The message was clear. They weren't here to negotiate. Marcus saw Tommy signal from behind the garage, his hands forming the old road signs they'd used decades ago. 3 minutes to full readiness. The boy had done good work, but Marcus wondered if it would be enough. The first move came from Kor himself. He raised his hand, and Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert morning. Dark energy rippled out from the serpent leader's position, and suddenly the very air seemed to thicken with malevolence. The town's defensive lights flickered and died, car engines coughed and fell silent, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "What the hell?" Deputy Collins's voice cracked with fear. Marcus felt his own power respond involuntarily, hellfire flaring bright in his chest. Whatever Kor had become in the last 20 years, it was far worse than simple human evil. The man had made deals that went deeper than revenge, darker than mere criminal ambition. That's when the serpents charged. They came in waves, engines roaring back to life, despite the supernatural interference. The first line hit the barricades with devastating force, but the townspeople held firm. Gunfire erupted from every window and defensive position, while the Hell Angels roared out to meet their enemies head-on. Marcus watched Sarah lead her riders in a flanking maneuver that would have made any military commander proud. But even as the two forces clashed in a storm of metal and flame, he could see the tide turning against them. The serpents had numbers, firepower, and something else, a darkness that seemed to strengthen them with every passing moment. Explosion rocked the gas station as one of Kor's lieutenants hurled something that definitely wasn't a normal grenade. Supernatural fire, green and hungry, began spreading across the building despite Tommy's attempts to contain it with a fire extinguisher. The boy was in danger. Sarah was outnumbered 3-1. The townspeople were being pushed back inch by bloody inch. Marcus closed his eyes and let 20 years of careful control finally slip away. The fire erupted through his veins like a dam bursting, transforming flesh and bone into something beyond mortal understanding. When he opened his eyes again, they burned with the light of judgment itself. The Ghost Rider was done hiding. He leaped from the water tower, supernatural flame trailing behind him like wings of vengeance. The desert wind carried the acrid smell of burning rubber and spilled gasoline as Marcus revved the legendary Hell Angels bike one final time. Behind him, the town of Perdition's Crossing burned in scattered patches where the serpents had tried to flush them out with Molotov cocktails. The plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of driving Marcus and the townspeople into the open, it had only given them more cover in the chaos. Sheriff Elena Vasquez wiped blood from a cut above her eyebrow and checked her ammunition. 3 rounds left in her service weapon, and at least a dozen serpents still moving through the streets like predators stalking wounded prey. The local volunteers had fought better than anyone expected, but they were farmers and shopkeepers, not warriors. They'd done their part, now it was time for the ghosts to finish this. "You ready for this?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer from the way Marcus's eyes had changed. The warm brown she'd grown accustomed to over the past few days had darkened to something that reflected flames even in shadow. Marcus nodded toward the main street, where Viktor Kozlov's distinctive chrome and black Harley sat idling. The serpent's leader hadn't moved from his position in 20 minutes, content to let his men do the dirty work while he waited for Marcus to show himself. It was exactly the kind of arrogance that had gotten the original Hell Angels killed 2 decades ago. "Victor's mine," Marcus said, his voice carrying an otherworldly echo that made the bike's engine purr in response. "But his lieutenant, Scar, he's the one who actually lit the match that night. He's been hiding behind Victor's reputation ever since." Through the smoke, they could see Scar's bulky frame moving between buildings, directing the remaining serpents with military precision. The man had clearly learned a few things in 20 years, but Marcus had learned more. Death had a way of teaching patience that the living couldn't comprehend. Elena placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, feeling the supernatural heat radiating through his leather jacket. "When this is over, I'll finally be able to rest," he finished. "The Hell Angels can ride into whatever comes next, knowing their brotherhood was avenged." The weight of finality in his words hit her harder than expected. She'd known this moment would come, had understood from the beginning that Marcus wasn't really alive in any conventional sense. But watching him prepare to fade away felt like losing someone all over again. Explosion rocked the hardware store across the street, sending debris cascading onto the asphalt. Through the dust cloud, 3 serpents emerged, assault rifles trained on the alley where Marcus and Elena had taken cover. Time for talking was over. Marcus kicked the Hell Angel's bike into gear and roared out of the alley like a bat out of hell, literally. Elena had seen him ride before, but this was different. The bike left trails of blue flame in its wake, and Marcus's form seemed to flicker between solid and translucent as he carved impossible turns through the street. The first serpent never had time to adjust his aim. Marcus's chain whip caught him across the chest, with enough force to send the man flying through a storefront window. The second managed to get off a burst of automatic fire, but the bullets passed harmlessly through Marcus's ghostly form before he solidified again and clotheslined the gunman off his feet. Viktor Kozlov finally moved, his chrome Harley screaming as he accelerated toward the confrontation. Behind him, Scar and 4 more serpents formed a wedge formation, their engines drowning out everything except the sound of impending violence. Elena flanked wide, using the burning buildings as cover while she worked her way toward Scar's position. She might only have 3 bullets left, but she'd make them count. The townspeople were depending on her, and more importantly, Marcus was depending on her to handle Scar while he dealt with Viktor. The 2 bikes met in the center of Main Street, with a crash that sounded like thunder. Viktor had produced a sawed-off shotgun from somewhere and fired point-blank at Marcus's chest, but the ghostly rider simply absorbed the blast and kept coming. His chain wrapped around Viktor's throat, and suddenly both men were grappling at 60 miles per hour while their bikes screamed toward the town limits. Elena lined up her shot just as Scar turned his rifle toward Marcus's exposed back. Her first bullet took the lieutenant in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. Her second went wide as she dove to avoid return fire. 1 shot left, and Scar was already moving for better cover. In the distance, Marcus and Viktor's bikes separated with a shower of sparks, both riders still mounted but clearly battered. The final confrontation was building to its crescendo, and Elena knew that everything, the town's survival, Marcus's peace, and the settling of a 20-year-old blood debt, would be decided in the next few minutes. The desert held its breath, waiting for ghosts to finally find their rest. The Devil's Teeth roared into town like a plague of locusts, their engines screaming through the desert night. Jake stood at the edge of Main Street, watching the headlights cut through the darkness like fallen stars. 23 bikes. He counted them as they formed their battle line, exhaust pipes glowing red-hot in the moonlight. Behind him, the townspeople had barricaded themselves in the diner and the hardware store. Sheriff Martinez crouched behind her patrol car, rifle ready. The surviving members of Jake's old brotherhood, Tommy, Bear, and Raven, flanked him on either side, their bikes idling with supernatural energy that made the air itself hum. Vincent Cray dismounted his massive chopper at the center of the Devil's Teeth formation. Even after 20 years, Jake recognized that cruel smile, those dead eyes that had haunted his dreams. Cray had aged badly. His face was scarred from countless fights, his hair gone gray, but the malice radiating from him remained unchanged. "Jacob Kane," Cray called out, his voice carrying across the silent street. "I heard rumors you crawled out of hell, but I had to see for myself." Jake walked forward, his boots echoing on the asphalt. With each step, the phantom flames that wreathed his body grew brighter, casting dancing shadows on the buildings around them. "You always did believe your own lies, Vincent. I never went to hell. I brought it back with me." The standoff stretched like a taut wire. The Devil's Teeth revved their engines in unison, a thunderous war cry that shattered windows and set car alarms wailing. But Jake's brotherhood answered with something far more terrifying, the sound of the dead rising, their bikes screaming with otherworldly power that made the very ground tremble. "You cost me everything," Cray snarled, drawing a sawed-off shotgun from his bike. My reputation, my territory, spent 20 years rebuilding what you destroyed. What I destroyed? Jake's laugh was hollow, bitter. You murdered my brothers, shot them down like dogs while they slept. They were weak. You were all weak, hiding behind your precious code of honor. Cray pumped the shotgun. But I learned something about you that night, Kane. You burned just like everyone else. The first shot came from somewhere in the Devil's Teeth ranks, a wild, nervous pull that sparked off the asphalt near Jake's feet. That single gunshot shattered the tension like glass. All hell broke loose. The Devil's Teeth surged forward in a wedge formation, engines roaring, muzzle flashes lighting up their faces like demonic masks. Jake leaped onto his Hell Angel's bike as it materialized beneath him in a burst of supernatural fire. The machine howled to life, its engine note deeper and more primal than anything built by human hands. Tommy flanked left, his bike leaving a trail of blue flames as he carved through two Devil's Teeth riders, sending them tumbling into the sand. Bear went right, his massive frame absorbing gunshots that would have killed a mortal man, his bike's front wheel crushing Vincent's lieutenant against a parked car. Jake rode straight into the heart of the formation, directly at Cray. Bullets passed through him like he was made of smoke and fire, while his return strikes were devastatingly real. His bike's front wheel caught one rider in the chest, launching him 30 feet through the air. Another tried to ram him from the side, only to have his motorcycle burst into flames at Jake's touch. Sheriff Martinez and her deputies opened fire from their positions, catching the Devil's Teeth in a crossfire that forced them to split their attention. The townspeople weren't helpless victims anymore. They were defending their home, their sanctuary. Cray emptied his shotgun at Jake, the buckshot spreading through the Ghost Rider's torso without effect. As Jake closed the distance between them, Cray's eyes went wide with the first real fear Jake had seen in them. "What are you?" Cray screamed, backing his bike toward the desert. "Justice," Jake replied, reaching out with one burning hand. But Cray was cunning, even in panic. He grabbed a metal chain from his bike and swung it in a wide arc, the iron links disrupting Jake's supernatural form just enough to create an opening. Cray gunned his engine and broke away, racing toward the highway with the surviving members of his gang. Jake pursued, his Hell Angel's bike gaining ground with every heartbeat. The wind whipped through his burning hair as he closed the gap, revenge within his grasp after 20 years of waiting. Behind them, the town burned with scattered fires from the battle. Sirens wailed in the distance, state police, probably, drawn by reports of the gunfight. But Jake only had eyes for Cray's fleeing form ahead of him. The chase carried them into the deep desert, where 20 years ago everything had begun. Where tonight, one way or another, everything would end. Cray glanced back over his shoulder, his face a mask of terror in the supernatural glow of Jake's pursuit. The hunter had become the hunted, and there would be no mercy in this final reckoning. The Crimson Serpent's engines roared like thunder as they crested the hill overlooking Perdition Valley. Dust devils swirled in their wake, carrying the scent of oil and violence. Marcus Viper Kellerman raised his fist, and 40 motorcycles rumbled to a halt. Below them, the town looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile. 20 years, he muttered, pulling off his helmet. Grey streaked his black hair now, and deep lines carved his weathered face, but his eyes burned with the same cold fury that had driven him to torch the Hell Angels clubhouse all those years ago. 20 years, and that ghost still haunts my dreams. His lieutenant, a scarred man called Reaper, pulled alongside. "You sure he's really back, Viper? Could just be some pretender riding his colors." Marcus spat into the dust. "I know that bike song, brother. That's the Devil's Chariot down there. And if Jake Torino's ghost wants to dance, I'll put him back in the ground myself." The wind shifted, carrying an unnatural chill that made the hardened bikers shiver despite the desert heat. In the distance, a single headlight pierced the gathering dusk, not the warm yellow of halogen, but the cold blue-white of hellfire. Jake Torino felt the rage building as he rode through Perdition Valley's empty streets. The town had cleared out hours ago when word spread that the serpents were coming. Smart folks. This wasn't their fight, though they'd shed blood for it already. Old Pete's sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. The devil's chariot purred beneath him, its engine singing a song of vengeance that resonated in his bones. 20 years of wandering, of being neither alive nor dead, had led to this moment. The supernatural flames that wreathed his skull cast dancing shadows on the buildings as he passed. He pulled up in front of Martinez's garage, where Maria waited with a shotgun cradled in her arms. Her face was pale but determined. "You don't have to be here," Jake said, his voice carrying the echo of distant thunder. "Like hell I don't. This is my town too." She pumped the shotgun. "Besides, someone needs to watch your back." Before Jake could respond, the rumble of approaching engines filled the air. The crimson serpents poured into Main Street like a red tide, their bikes forming a semicircle around the garage. Marcus dismounted slowly, his leather jacket creaking as he spread his arms wide. "Well, well, the dead do walk." His voice carried clearly in the still air. "Though you look a little worse for wear, Jake. Death doesn't suit you." Jake stepped into the street, his boots clicking on the asphalt. Where he walked, small flames sprouted and died. "You should have left well enough alone, Marcus. This town was under my protection." "Your protection?" Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You're dead, remember? I put a bullet in your head myself before I burned your clubhouse down. Nothing but smoke and mirrors now. Then you won't mind facing these smoke and mirrors alone." Jake's eyes blazed brighter. "Like a real 1%er? Or are you all about the numbers now?" The challenge hung in the desert air like a thrown gauntlet. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he couldn't back down in front of his crew. He pulled a chrome revolver from his jacket, the same gun that had killed Jake 20 years ago. "Just you and me then, Ghost Rider. Let's finish this." The two men began walking toward each other, their footsteps unnaturally loud. When 20 feet separated them, Marcus raised his gun and fired. The bullet passed through Jake's chest, leaving trails of supernatural fire in its wake, but didn't slow him down. Marcus's eyes widened in terror as he emptied the cylinder into the approaching spectre. Each shot found its mark, each shot passed harmlessly through. Jake reached out with one flaming hand and grasped Marcus by the throat, lifting him off the ground. "You want to know what hell looks like?" Jake's voice had become something inhuman, multitoned and terrible. "Let me show you." Marcus screamed as supernatural fire raced up Jake's arm and engulfed them both. The watching bikers backed away in terror as their leader's screams echoed off the canyon walls. When the flames died, Marcus fell to his knees, his hair white as snow, his eyes wide and vacant. "The highway to hell is paved with betrayal," Jake said softly. "Remember that in whatever asylum they put you in." The remaining serpents fled without a backward glance, leaving their broken leader rocking back and forth in the dust, muttering about flames and judgment. Jake felt the change immediately. The fire that had burned in his skull for 20 years began to dim. His brotherhood was avenged. Old Pete's death was answered. The debt was paid. Maria approached cautiously as the supernatural flames died completely, revealing Jake's human face once more. But even as she reached for him, he was already fading, becoming translucent. "Time to ride that last highway," he said, smiling peacefully. "Take care of this place." The devil's chariot gave one final roar and vanished into the desert night, carrying its rider home at last.